he hid 3 bank accounts. I found all of them before the judge did. I want to start with that sentence, because for 11 months, my husband and his family rehearsed the end of our marriage in rooms I wasn't invited into, made decisions about my financial future in conversations I never knew were happening, and built an entire quiet architecture around the assumption that by the time I finally understood what was happening, it would already be too late to do anything about it. I want to tell you exactly how I found out and exactly what I did once I did. Because I think, if you've ever discovered that people who claim to love you were quietly preparing for your downfall behind your back, you already understand the particular kind of cold that settles into you in that moment. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the moments people finally uncover what was carefully hidden from them, and the calm, undeniable proof that eventually sets the record straight. If you've ever sensed that something in your own life didn't quite add up, I hope this story gives you the same kind of clarity it eventually gave me. My name is Rachel. I am 38 years old, and I was married to a man named David for 12 years before I discovered that the final year of our marriage had actually been, from his side of things, an extended, carefully managed exit strategy, planned in detail with his mother and his sister, long before he ever said a single word to me about wanting a divorce. I want to tell you about our marriage first, or at least the version of it I believed I was living inside, because I think understanding what I thought was true makes it easier to understand exactly how disorienting it was to discover what actually was. David and I met in our late 20s, both of us working at the same regional accounting firm, though in different departments, he in corporate tax and I in the audit division. I remember our first real conversation clearly. An office happy hour neither of us particularly wanted to attend. Standing near a sad little cheese platter while he made an unexpectedly sharp joke about the firm's outdated expense reporting software. We were married 2 years later, in a modest ceremony that felt, at the time, like the beginning of something built to last. Two careful, practical people who understood, better than most, how to plan for a stable future. I remember our wedding day specifically because of how unremarkable, in the best possible sense, it actually was. No elaborate venue, no extravagant guest list, just close family, and a handful of good friends gathered in a small garden behind David's parents' house, a ceremony my mother-in-law Patricia had actually helped organize with considerable warmth at the time, fussing over table arrangements and seating charts with what seemed, in that moment, like genuine maternal affection for the daughter-in-law she was gaining. I think about that day often now, the particular irony of a woman who would eventually spend nearly a year quietly helping her son minimize what I would receive in a divorce having once stood beside me, toasting our future together with what appeared to be entirely sincere warmth. For most of those 12 years, I believed we were doing exactly that. Building something built to last. We bought a house together in our 4th year of marriage. A modest 3-bedroom colonial we spent years slowly renovating ourselves, tearing up ugly carpet on weekends, repainting rooms one at a time as our budget allowed. I remember the specific pride we both took in that slow, deliberate renovation process. David teaching himself basic tiling from online videos for our kitchen backsplash, me spending an entire October weekend stripping decades of old wallpaper from what would eventually become our small home office. We built over those years a genuinely comfortable financial life. Dual incomes carefully managed, retirement accounts contributed to consistently. A small emergency fund we rarely had to touch because we planned carefully enough to avoid most emergencies in the first place. I want to be honest with you about the specific dynamic in our marriage regarding money, because it matters enormously for understanding how what eventually happened was even possible. David had always handled the more detailed financial planning in our household, a natural extension, I assumed at the time, of his professional expertise in corporate tax and accounting. I handled our day-to-day budgeting, the grocery spending, the household bills, the smaller decisions that kept our daily life running. But the larger financial architecture, the investment accounts, the retirement planning, the specific structure of how our joint assets were organized, I had, over the years, increasingly deferred to him, trusting his professional expertise the same way you might trust a doctor in the family to handle medical decisions without demanding a second opinion every single time. I understand now, looking back, how that particular division of labor, reasonable as it seemed at the time, eventually created exactly the kind of blind spot David and his family would spend the better part of a year quietly exploiting. David's family and I had always had what I would describe as a cordial but slightly distant relationship. His mother, Patricia, was a formidable woman, a retired family law attorney, who had built a considerable reputation over a 30-year career specifically representing wealthy clients through complicated, high-asset divorces. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because it matters enormously for everything that follows. David's mother had spent 3 decades of her professional life learning exactly how people hide assets during divorce proceedings, exactly what mistakes lead to those hidden assets eventually being discovered, and exactly how to construct a financial exit strategy sophisticated enough to withstand serious scrutiny. I remember, actually, several dinner conversations over the years where Patricia had described, in general, professional terms, some of the more memorable cases from her career. Always careful to protect client confidentiality, but clearly proud of her particular skill at navigating complex asset division. I remember finding those stories genuinely fascinating at the time, admiring her sharp, analytical mind, never once imagining that the same expertise she described so casually over dinner would eventually be turned, with equal precision, against my own financial interests. His sister, Whitney, worked in wealth management at a private banking firm 2 states away, a career that had given her considerable expertise in exactly the kind of account structuring and asset movement that would eventually become relevant to what happened to my marriage. Whitney and I had always been friendly during family gatherings, though our relationship remained fairly surface level, limited mostly to holiday visits and the occasional group vacation, never quite developing into the closer friendship I sometimes wished existed between us, given how much time our respective marriages into and within this family should have naturally afforded us to grow closer. I tell you about their professions not to suggest that everyone in a legal or financial career is secretly plotting against their family members, but because I think it's important to understand that when David eventually decided our marriage was ending, he did not navigate that decision alone, or even primarily with his own judgment. He had, sitting readily available to him, 2 of the most qualified people imaginable to help him construct a financial exit strategy specifically designed to minimize what I would eventually receive in a divorce settlement, and he used both of them extensively, for the better part of a year, without my knowledge. I want to walk you through how I eventually discovered all of this, because the unraveling happened slowly, in pieces, each one individually explainable until the full pattern finally became impossible to ignore. It began, I now understand, almost exactly 14 months before David finally told me he wanted a divorce, though I didn't recognize the beginning for what it actually was until many months later, working backward through evidence with a forensic accountant who helped me reconstruct the entire timeline in painstaking detail. The first thing I noticed, though I dismissed it easily at the time, was a subtle change in David's relationship with his mother. Where their phone calls had typically been brief, occasional, mostly centered around holiday planning or updates about his aging father's health, they became considerably more frequent, sometimes daily, often conducted with David stepping into his home office and closing the door. A habit that struck me, in the moment, as simply a natural desire for privacy, during what I assumed were ordinary family conversations. I remember asking him, once about 6 months into this pattern, what he and his mother had been discussing so extensively lately. He told me, without much elaboration, that she'd been going through some difficult health concerns of her own, that she wasn't ready to share widely yet, and that he was simply trying to support her through it privately. I believed him entirely. I had no reason not to. David had always been close to his mother, and supporting a parent through a private health concern seemed like exactly the kind of thing a devoted son would handle discreetly. I understand now, with the benefit of everything I eventually learned, that those daily conversations had nothing to do with Patricia's health, and everything to do with the careful, methodical construction of a plan to end our marriage in a way that would leave David in the strongest possible financial position, regardless of what that meant for me. The second thing I noticed, several months later, was a series of small, seemingly unrelated changes to our financial accounts. David mentioned casually that he'd consolidated some of our older investment accounts into a new brokerage he'd found offered better fee structures. He mentioned separately, weeks later, that he'd set up a new business consulting entity, a side venture he described as an occasional freelance tax consulting practice he was building slowly on weekends, something to supplement our income and give him a creative outlet outside his primary job. He mentioned still separately that he'd opened a new checking account specifically to manage expenses related to this new consulting venture, keeping it cleanly separated from our household accounts for tax purposes. I remember each of these conversations individually, scattered across several weeks that spring, always delivered in the same easy, matter-of-fact tone David used for any ordinary household administrative update. The kind of conversation that happens over dinner or while loading the dishwasher, brief and unremarkable in the moment. I remember even feeling a small flicker of pride, at the time, hearing about his new consulting venture, genuinely pleased that he was pursuing something creative and financially productive outside his regular job, entirely unaware that I was, in each of these small conversations, being told just enough truth to avoid outright lying, while the actual purpose behind each change remained carefully, deliberately obscured. Each of these changes individually seemed entirely reasonable, the kind of small financial adjustments any two people managing a shared life together might make over the course of a year. I had no reason at the time to view any single one of them with suspicion. It was only much later, working with a forensic accountant to reconstruct the full pattern, that I understood exactly what these seemingly unrelated changes had actually accomplished. Together, they created a financial structure that made it considerably more difficult to trace the full scope of our actual joint assets, spreading funds across multiple newer accounts, some technically outside our established joint financial history, in ways that would make a future division of marital assets considerably more complicated to fully untangle. The third thing I noticed, and this is the one that finally, slowly, began raising real concern in me, was a subtle but unmistakable change in David's emotional presence in our marriage over those final several months. He grew quieter, more distant, spending increasing amounts of time either at his office or in his home study. Conversations between us growing shorter, more transactional, focused almost entirely on logistics rather than the genuine ongoing connection we'd maintained fairly consistently throughout most of our marriage. I remember asking him, more than once during that period, whether something was wrong, whether we needed to talk about anything, and he consistently told me he was simply stressed about work, a new project at his firm, demanding more of his attention than usual. I remember one specific dinner, perhaps 2 months before I finally discovered the truth, where I tried, more directly than I had in months, to actually name the distance I'd been feeling between us. I asked him gently whether he still felt happy in our marriage, whether there was anything he needed from me that he felt he wasn't getting. He reached across the table and took my hand, told me he loved me, told me the stress was entirely external, entirely about work, and asked me almost tenderly not to worry so much. I remember feeling genuinely reassured by that conversation at the time, grateful for what I believed was his honest reassurance, entirely unaware that I had, in that exact moment, been offered a carefully calculated performance, rather than the genuine vulnerability I'd hoped for. I believed him, largely because I had no specific reason not to, and because the alternative explanation, that my husband was actively, methodically preparing to end our marriage while simultaneously reassuring me that everything was fine, felt, at the time, too cynical, too calculated to genuinely fit the man I'd spent 12 years building a life alongside. I want to tell you about the specific evening everything finally began unraveling because I remember it with a clarity that still surprises me, given how ordinary it seemed in its first several minutes. It was a Wednesday evening in late autumn, and I had come home earlier than usual. My afternoon meetings canceled unexpectedly, giving me an unplanned free hour before David typically returned from his office. I remember settling onto the couch with my laptop, intending to catch up on some personal email, when I noticed David had left his own laptop open on the kitchen table, still logged into his email from that morning, an oversight that, in 12 years of marriage, had happened perhaps only a handful of times before. David typically being scrupulously careful about closing out his work accounts before leaving for the office each day. I remember the specific quality of light in our kitchen that evening, the early dusk of late autumn already settling in through the window above the sink. The particular quiet of an empty house I rarely experienced given our usually overlapping schedules. I had put on water for tea, the kettle beginning its slow climb toward a whistle, and I was reaching past David's laptop for a mug from the cabinet above it when the screen, still illuminated, caught my eye entirely by accident. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think the ethics of it matter to this story. I did not go looking for anything specific. I had no active suspicion, at that point, that anything significant was wrong in our marriage, beyond the general distance I'd noticed over recent months. I simply glanced at his screen while passing through the kitchen to refill my coffee, intending nothing more than the kind of casual, unthinking glance you might give any open device in a shared household. What caught my attention was an email subject line that read simply, "Re-timeline discussion, confidential." The sender was his mother, Patricia. I want to tell you that I initially scrolled past it, some old, deeply ingrained instinct toward respecting privacy pulling me away from a screen that clearly wasn't intended for me. But something in the specific phrasing, timeline discussion, and confidential, in the same subject line regarding a conversation with his mother, snagged at something in my memory. The months of increasingly frequent private calls, the closed office door, the vague explanation about her health that had never quite fully made sense to me. I remember the kettle finally reaching its whistle behind me while I stood frozen at that kitchen table, the sound sharp and insistent in the otherwise quiet house, and I remember turning it off without quite registering the motion, my attention entirely consumed by the small, glowing rectangle of David's screen in front of me. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, genuinely torn between the deeply ingrained instinct to look away and a slower, quieter, more insistent feeling that something about this particular email deserved more scrutiny than my usual respect for his privacy would normally allow. I opened the email. I want to describe, as clearly as I can, exactly what I found in that message, because it fundamentally reorganized my understanding of the previous 14 months of my own life in the span of about 90 seconds. The email from Patricia referenced, in careful, clinical language, a revised timeline for the transition, discussing specific dates for what she called the formal conversation with Rachel, recommendations about which assets should be moved into David's newly established consulting business account before that conversation took place, and a note reminding him to ensure the freelance consulting income remained clearly separated from marital funds for at least 6 months prior to filing. A specific legal strategy, I would later learn from my own attorney, designed to make certain funds appear to be pre-established separate business assets, rather than marital property subject to equal division. I remember reading my own name in that email, the formal conversation with Rachel, and feeling something genuinely strange happen in my chest. The specific disorienting sensation of seeing yourself referred to as a problem to be strategically managed, rather than a person to be honestly spoken with. I read that phrase 3 separate times before I could make myself continue scrolling through the rest of the message. I sat at that kitchen table for what felt like a very long time, reading and rereading that email, before I opened his sent folder and began, carefully, methodically, reading backward through months of correspondence between David, his mother, and in several threads, his sister Whitney as well. I want to tell you what I found, because I think the full scope of it matters for understanding exactly what I was up against. Over the previous 11 months, David had been working with his mother, drawing on her 3 decades of family law expertise, to construct a detailed, deliberate financial exit strategy from our marriage. His sister had assisted in structuring several of the actual account movements, using her wealth management expertise to help identify banking institutions and account structures that would make the eventual tracing of assets more complicated for anyone without specialized forensic accounting knowledge. The freelance consulting business, David had mentioned to me months earlier, casually, as a creative side project, was, according to these emails, established specifically as a vehicle for redirecting a portion of his bonus income and existing investment returns into an account structure that his mother believed could plausibly be argued, in divorce proceedings, as separate business property rather than marital assets, despite the fact that no actual meaningful consulting business had ever genuinely operated, the entity existing almost entirely as a financial holding structure rather than any real functioning enterprise. There were, across those 11 months of correspondence, references to 3 specific accounts I had never known existed. A brokerage account opened under the consulting business's name, funded gradually over several months with transfers his mother had specifically advised him to structure in amounts small enough to avoid triggering certain reporting thresholds. A second checking account opened at a bank we had never used together, where his sister had helped him establish automatic transfers from his paycheck that were labeled internally as business operating expenses, despite funding what appeared from the correspondence to be largely personal savings. And a third account, the one that disturbed me most when I finally understood its purpose, a modest trust structure his mother had helped him establish, funded with a portion of an inheritance he'd received from a grandmother 2 years earlier, money I had always understood, based on what he'd told me at the time, had simply been folded into our general joint savings, but that, according to these emails, had actually been quietly redirected into a separate trust, specifically to keep it entirely outside any future marital asset calculation. I want to be honest with you about how I felt. Sitting at that kitchen table, slowly working through 11 months of careful, calculated planning that had been happening entirely behind my back, orchestrated by 2 people I had always considered, if not close family, at least people who wished me no particular harm. I did not cry immediately. I want to tell you that, because I think it surprised me at the time, how calm, how strangely clinical my own reaction felt in those first several hours. I think some part of me was already, instinctively, understanding that whatever emotional reckoning I eventually needed to have with this betrayal, my most urgent priority, in that immediate moment, was simply documentation, preserving exactly what I had found, before David returned home, and had any opportunity to realize what I'd seen, and begin covering his tracks further. I forwarded the most critical emails to my own personal account, carefully, methodically, the same instinct for careful documentation that had served me well throughout my career in audit work, now applied to the sudden, unexpected audit of my own marriage. I took screenshots of the full email threads, capturing not just individual messages but the complete conversation chains that established the clear, unmistakable timeline of when this planning had actually begun. I closed his laptop exactly as I had found it, and I sat with what I now knew for the remaining hour before he returned home, trying to decide, carefully, exactly how I wanted to proceed. David came home that evening entirely unaware that anything had changed. He made a comment about a difficult client meeting, poured himself a glass of wine, asked what I wanted to do about dinner, all with the same easy, ordinary tone he'd maintained throughout our entire marriage. And I remember watching him move through our kitchen, our home, with a strange, disorienting clarity, understanding that I was looking for the first time in nearly a year at the actual truth of where our marriage stood, rather than the carefully maintained performance he had been offering me instead. I did not confront him that night. I want to explain why, because I think the decision matters. I understood, sitting with what I'd discovered, that I was significantly behind in a process David and his family had already been carefully constructing for nearly a year. If I confronted him immediately, emotionally, without any further preparation, I risked simply alerting him to exactly what I now knew, giving him and his mother the opportunity to further obscure or restructure whatever remained of the plan before I had any real leverage to address it properly. I called a divorce attorney the following morning, a recommendation from a colleague at my firm who specialized specifically in complex asset division cases, a woman named Diane Kessler, who had, it turned out, actually gone up against David's mother in court twice during Patricia's own practicing years, giving her a particular valuable familiarity with exactly the kind of strategies Patricia was likely to employ. I want to tell you about that first meeting with Diane because it fundamentally shaped everything that followed. I brought the screenshots I'd captured, laid them out across her conference table, and watched her expression shift, slowly from professional neutrality to something closer to genuine focused concern as she worked through the full timeline. Her office was quiet, orderly, a wall of law degrees and framed case commendations behind her desk that in another circumstance might have felt intimidating, but that afternoon simply felt reassuring, evidence that I was finally, after weeks of carrying this discovery entirely alone, sitting across from someone qualified to actually help me address it properly. She told me directly that what I had discovered represented a serious, deliberate effort to conceal marital assets, precisely the kind of case her firm specialized in unwinding, but that we would need considerably more than the screenshots alone to build an airtight case, particularly given that David's mother's professional background meant she had almost certainly structured everything with an unusual degree of legal sophistication. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she recognized Patricia's name immediately, having faced her twice in court years earlier, describing her, with a kind of wry, professional respect, as thorough in ways that usually take considerably more effort to unwind than most opposing counsel's work. She recommended immediately that I retain a forensic accountant, someone with specific expertise in tracing hidden or restructured marital assets, before I did anything else, including before I said a single word to David about what I'd discovered. The forensic accountant Diane connected me with, a meticulous, unflappable woman named Sandra Voss, spent the following 6 weeks working through our full financial history, cross-referencing years of joint tax returns, bank statements, and investment account records against the timeline established by the emails I'd found, gradually building a complete, undeniable picture of exactly how much had been moved, when, and through which specific mechanisms. I met with Sandra twice during those 6 weeks. Brief updates in her small, cluttered office lined with filing cabinets and dual computer monitors displaying spreadsheets dense enough to make my head spin, despite my own professional background in audit work. She explained her process to me in the second meeting with a particular kind of patient thoroughness, describing how she cross-referenced the timing of specific transfers against corresponding entries in David's sent email folder, building a chronological map that left almost no room for alternative explanation once the full pattern became visible. She told me, at one point, with what I recognized as genuine professional satisfaction, that whoever had helped structure these accounts clearly understood certain legal thresholds well, but had made one consistent, subtle error, failing to account for the fact that a forensic review with access to the full original email timeline, rather than just the bank statements alone, could reconstruct intent as clearly as it could reconstruct dollar amounts. What Sandra's investigation eventually revealed exceeded even what I'd initially understood from the emails alone. The 3 accounts I'd identified from David's correspondence held, combined, just over $318,000. Funds that had originated almost entirely from what should have been considered marital assets under the law of our state, our joint investment returns, a portion of his annual bonuses that had historically always been treated as shared household income, and the grandmother's inheritance that he had specifically told me, at the time he received it, was being folded into our general savings. Sandra also discovered something the emails alone hadn't fully revealed, a pattern of slightly reduced reported income on David's most recent pay stubs, compared to his actual salary. The difference redirected, through an arrangement with his employer's HR department that Whitney had apparently helped him negotiate, into a supplemental retirement account, structured in a way that wouldn't appear on the standard financial disclosures typically exchanged during divorce proceedings unless someone specifically knew to request that particular account category. I continued living in our house with David for the following 6 weeks while Sandra completed her investigation, an experience I still find difficult to fully describe. We continued our ordinary domestic routines, dinner conversations, weekend errands, all while I carried the specific, exhausting knowledge of exactly what he and his family had been quietly constructing behind my back for nearly a year. I want to be honest that this period tested me in ways I hadn't expected. The particular strain of maintaining an ordinary facade while privately preparing for what I now understood was an inevitable, significant legal confrontation. I remember specific evenings during those 6 weeks with unusual clarity, sitting across from David at our kitchen table over dinners I had cooked from the same recipes I'd been cooking for years, listening to him describe an ordinary day at work, nodding along, asking the same kinds of follow-up questions I always had, while some entirely separate part of my mind was quietly cataloging every small gesture, every slight evasion, Every moment where I could now see, with painful new clarity, the careful performance he had been maintaining for months. I remember one particular Saturday morning, watching him mow our lawn from the kitchen window, methodical and unhurried in the same way he approached everything, and feeling a strange, disorienting grief for a version of him, and a version of us, that I now understood had likely stopped being fully real considerably earlier than I'd ever suspected. I confided in exactly one person during those 6 weeks. A close friend from college named Priya who had gone through her own difficult divorce years earlier and understood, instinctively, the particular importance of discretion during this kind of preparation. She became, during that period, an essential source of steadiness. Someone I could speak with honestly about the exhausting strangeness of continuing an ordinary domestic life while quietly building a legal case against the person sharing that life with me, without any risk of that conversation somehow finding its way back to David or his family before I was ready. David finally told me he wanted a divorce on a Sunday evening in early spring, almost exactly 11 months after that first email from his mother, referencing the timeline discussion. He delivered the news carefully, gently, in language that felt, even in the moment, clearly rehearsed, explaining that he'd been unhappy for a long time, that he thought we'd grown apart, that he hoped we could handle the process amicably and fairly for both of us. I remember him sitting across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where I had discovered his mother's email months earlier, hands folded in front of him in a posture that struck me, even as he spoke, as somehow performed, careful, the posture of a man who had rehearsed this exact conversation more than once, perhaps even with his mother playing my part in some earlier practice run I would never know about but could easily imagine, given everything else I now understood about how thoroughly this entire process had been planned. He used the phrase grown apart twice during that conversation, a phrase that felt to me suspiciously clinical, suspiciously well-worn, the kind of language a careful family law attorney might specifically recommend to a client hoping to frame an ending as mutual rather than unilateral. I remember watching him deliver that carefully prepared speech, understanding, with a strange, cold clarity, that I was witnessing the final scene of a script he had been quietly rehearsing with his mother for nearly a year. And I remember making a deliberate choice, in that moment, not to reveal yet exactly how much I already knew. I told him I understood, that I agreed the marriage had grown difficult, and that I would want to handle the divorce through proper legal channels, with attorneys managing the financial details, a suggestion he readily agreed to, clearly relieved that I was approaching the conversation with the kind of calm, reasonable tone that likely matched whatever expectations his mother had helped him prepare for. What David did not know, walking into our first formal mediation session 6 weeks later, was that I arrived with Diane Kessler beside me, and with Sandra Voss's complete forensic report, a document that laid out, in exhaustive, undeniable detail, the full timeline and scope of exactly what he and his family had spent the better part of a year quietly constructing. I want to describe that mediation session carefully, because it represents, I think, the actual heart of this story. The moment where nearly a year of careful, secretive planning finally met an equally careful, equally thorough response. David arrived with his own attorney, a competent but clearly unprepared man, who had, it became evident within the first 20 minutes, been given only a partial, sanitized version of David's actual financial situation, unaware of the full scope of the hidden accounts his client had spent nearly a year constructing with his mother's guidance. I remember the conference room itself, a neutral, unremarkable space with a long table and a view of an unremarkable parking lot, chosen, I imagine, specifically for its lack of any particular character, a blank stage for what was about to unfold. Diane sat beside me, her folder of documents organized with the same meticulous precision I'd come to appreciate over our weeks of preparation, while across the table, David sat slightly apart from his attorney, his posture noticeably tense in a way that struck me, even then, as someone bracing for something he didn't yet fully understand was coming. Diane opened the financial disclosure portion of the mediation calmly, methodically, presenting Sandra's forensic report alongside copies of the email correspondence I had discovered, laying out, page by page, the complete timeline, the consulting business established without any genuine underlying operations, the checking account with transfers labeled as business expenses that funded personal savings, the trust structure built around an inheritance David had specifically told me was part of our joint finances. I watched David's face throughout that presentation, and I want to be honest that there was no satisfaction in it for me. Only a kind of exhausted, sad confirmation of exactly what I had already spent 6 weeks quietly preparing myself to face. I watched the specific moment his composure finally cracked. Somewhere around the third page of Sandra's report, when Diane read aloud the exact dollar figure quietly moved into the trust structure funded by his grandmother's inheritance. A number that seemed to land on him with a physical weight, his shoulders dropping slightly, his eyes finally, briefly, meeting mine across that table with an expression I could only describe as genuine, unguarded shame. His attorney, visibly caught off guard, requested a brief recess to confer privately with his client, and I remember sitting in the hallway outside that conference room, Diane beside me, feeling, for the first time in months, something close to actual relief. The specific relief of no longer having to carry a secret I'd been holding entirely alone. When mediation resumed, David's attorney adopted a considerably more conciliatory posture, and I understood, watching the shift, that whatever conversation had happened during that recess had involved David finally, belatedly, explaining to his own attorney exactly how much financial exposure this hidden asset structure actually represented. Now that it had been so thoroughly undeniably documented, I did not raise my voice through any part of that mediation. I had learned over the preceding 6 weeks of careful, methodical preparation that the truth, fully documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be effective. Diane and I proposed, based on Sandra's forensic findings, that the full $318,000 identified in the hidden accounts be treated as marital property subject to equal division, along with a corrected calculation of David's actual income for purposes of any spousal support determination, reflecting his true earnings rather than the artificially reduced figure his HR arrangement with Whitney's help had been designed to obscure. David's attorney, after a lengthy private consultation with his client, ultimately agreed to these terms rather than risk the case proceeding to a formal court hearing, where the forensic evidence Sandra had compiled would likely have resulted not only in the same financial outcome, but potentially in additional legal consequences for the deliberate concealment itself, a risk David, once he finally understood the full strength of the case against him, was apparently unwilling to take. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with David several weeks after that mediation concluded, because I think it matters for understanding how I eventually made peace with everything that happened. We met briefly to finalize some remaining logistics about dividing our shared household belongings, and near the end of that conversation, he asked me, quietly, how I had actually discovered everything. We met at a small coffee shop halfway between our two new residences, a neutral space neither of us had any particular history with, and I remember how strange it felt, sitting across from a man I had shared 12 years and a home with. Now speaking to him, with the careful, measured distance you might use with a former colleague rather than a former spouse. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen during the mediation itself, the adrenaline of that confrontation apparently having given way, in the weeks since, to something quieter and more genuinely reflective. I told him the truth, that I'd seen an email on his open laptop by accident, one evening when I came home early, and that everything afterward had simply been the result of careful, methodical documentation, once I understood what I was actually looking at. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and then he said, "My mother told me it would never actually be found. She said she'd built it carefully enough that even a forensic review probably wouldn't catch all of it." I told him honestly that his mother had clearly underestimated exactly how thoroughly a properly qualified forensic accountant, given a real starting timeline to work from, could actually trace even carefully structured financial movements. He asked me, near the end of that conversation, whether I hated him. I told him honestly that I didn't, not anymore, though I had, for several months, and that what I